My name is Pat Kristen. I'm president and CEO of Hope Lab, and it is my great privilege to get to interview these scientists now. A good portion of my job is actually spent with scientists trying to translate what they do into human English for the rest of us. So that's going to be a bit of my attempts this morning. Dan, we'll start with you. All right. You heard a lot in the presentation about the individual level psychological processes involved in the science here. Can you speak about how you think of the role of the social aspects, the community aspects of connection among individuals in promoting health and well-being?
Sure. You know, first of all, thanks for that beautiful presentation. Wasn't that incredible? Amazing work. You know, you can see how you can go from the molecules of DNA to the substance of what you do with your mind. And now, Pat, you're asking to address the idea of our social worlds.
Yes.
And in the world I work in, which is called interpersonal neurobiology, what we do is we try to look at the mind as not just something that comes from, let's say, your brain's function, but actually is both an embodied and a relational process. So in doing that, we ask if this process of the mind, which is both embodied and relational, happens, what makes for a healthy mind? And after a long integration of a lot of different sciences, we actually look at the concept called integration, which is the linkage of differentiated parts of things. So if you think about Sherry Turkle's beautiful presentation with Soren this morning, you can really see how a conversation is where your presence allows you to be fully open to whatever's going on inside of you, let's say within your body, but also whatever's coming from someone else. And the key to a relationship, let's say in a conversation, is the energy and information flow that's being shared between two individuals or among many individuals. So when you look at energy and information flow, you actually can see it as something that happens within you and between you, and that is what shapes mental processes. And for mental processes to be healthy, if you look at a process called integration, you can show when you link differentiated parts, let's say in a relationship, two people are having a conversation. And let's say, Pat, you and I, you can have your experience and I honor the difference between me and you. You honor the differences between us two. But then we link with compassionate communication, where we connect that way. That would be an integrated relationship. In the brain, you can actually look at all sorts of ways where when different systems in the brain are communicating but are allowed to be differentiated, left and right hemisphere, the higher and lower areas, then you actually get optimal functioning. And when optimal functioning does not occur, it either goes to chaos or rigidity. And these are actually, from a complexity theory point of view, mathematics, this is actually predicted when you see when a system is not integrated. So when you talk about social functioning, let's say in the internet world now in social media, ideally what you want to do is allow a person to bring their full presence, just like we heard beautifully presented by Steve and Alyssa, and then to really think about how does that presence allow for connection to happen in real time. Not where someone says, I'm just going to text and here's the actual view of what I'd like you to think I'm being, you know, but actually to be really there spontaneously. And when you look at integration, the outcome of integration is harmony. Integration creates a sense of flexibility and spontaneity and adaptability that ultimately is what we want to create. And it's basically, I think, the fundamental mechanism of well-being and health. And when integration is made visible, what's absolutely amazing about this, and this is through a long line of reasoning, integration made visible is kindness and compassion. So when you think about what Meng was teaching us, you know, this morning, for me, when I was listening to his wonderful words, it was all about the idea that you can actually go and say, I wish that person to be happy, is one of the most profound forms of integrative acts that you can do. And that's, I think, what presence is all about, is that presence allows for integration within you and even raises your telomerase, and presence allows for this deep sense of connection to others. And that's what integration creates.
So let me pick up on that for all three of you then. Talk a bit more about why this would be adaptive. From an evolutionary standpoint, why is it adaptive that this integration and connection is something that we're so drawn to? Alyssa.
Okay. Well, we have evolved in tribes, and we're safest in tribes, maybe not unlike some of the tribes we've formed here. this sense of connection is almost like a virtual safety net in the brain that damps down on the stress response. So from a stress perspective, it has been one of the most foundational findings is that support is stress buffering. It damps down stress reactivity, and people who feel supported live longer. People who feel lonely die earlier. And at a mechanistic level, we know that loneliness is related to this conserved transcriptional response to adversity, and having more support is related to longer telomeres. So some of the biological mechanisms are starting to be uncovered, but really it's one of the biggest frontiers. How does the social become the biological? And in the lab, when we stress people out, if they have someone close to them, they're less reactive, but just the schema, the concept of being supported may be playing a role, because people who are more socially connective show less cortisol reactivity, less inflammatory reactivity. And now with my colleague Eli Putterman at UCSF, we're looking at psychological processes that are different in supported people. Less rumination, for example.
Steve, do you have anything to add?
I think it struck us that the place where we initially discovered this conserved transcriptional response to adversity, this upregulation of inflammation, and this downregulation of antiviral responses and antibody responses, wasn't in the kinds of socio-environmental risk factors that, let's say, epidemiology tends to focus on, things like poverty or sort of exposure to toxins or chemicals. Really, where this first kind of exploded into our awareness was simply looking at people who suffer from what turns out to be the most robust epidemiologic risk factor, and that is a sense of detachment or isolation from the rest of humanity. It's really loneliness where we first discovered this coherent shift in what the genes were doing. And we subsequently then saw it in places like poverty and other kinds of adversity. Now there's almost no kind of adversity where we don't see this kind of thing. But it's really striking that perhaps the biggest and most fundamental regulator of what's going on at the level of our most internal processes, our genome, is actually the nature of our experience of the people around us, our sense of connection and safety and belongingness in communities.
Dan, anything to add?
Yeah, it's just beautiful what the two of you are saying. And when for me, I'm trained as an attachment researcher, which means I study the way parents and children interact to shape how their minds unfold and how their brains develop. And so for me, I like to look at an evolutionary perspective. And, we evolved as beings in connection with each other. Even the origins of the nervous system start actually, you have the sperm and egg get together, and then this one cell becomes 2, and then 4, and then 8, and 16, etc. And it gets big enough at one point where there's cells on the outside and cells on the inside, and then the nervous system involutes like this. It has this way where what's going to become the neural tube actually began as skin cells. And I say all that because even the origins of the brain and the whole nervous system start as skin cells that actually are the interface of the inner and the outer. And when you think about it that way, to consider the mind as both embodied and relational, it's going to be dealing with the inner world, including your genes and your telomeres and telomerase and all that, but it's going to be just as much about your interactions with other people. It's going to be between you and others. And that's sometimes hard for us to think about, but the mind is not just brain activity, which gets some neuroscientists really angry when you say that, but it's not. It's the mind is as much a social process as it is a neurological process. And when you consider that, then you say, well, what's shared in common between what happens in the body and the nervous system and what happens between us? And the fundamental unit that's shared in common is energy and information flow. So in our relationships, we share energy and information flow, and you do this through the internet as well. And then within the body, the nervous system is all about electrochemical energy transformations that represent information sometimes. So when you realize it that way, then you say, okay, could the internet actually become a source of promoting integration and not isolation? And then you could start thinking in a really creative way about how to take this notion that our minds are not just shaped by the internet, they're being created by the internet. It's like when I'm driving down the freeway and I see someone texting, my mind says, well, that's obviously dangerous, which of course it is. But I realize they're texting because they're driving along and they're really lonely or isolated or nothing's happening. They're bored. Like Sherry was talking about the funerals, they're bored. And someone texts them. In that moment, a human being is reaching out to communicate with them, which is basically the birth of their minds, right? So they get on and they start texting because they exist in the texting, not in the driving. And this is obviously the dangerous part of it. And what we need to do is take the positive part of it and see, can you actually allow people to go from isolation to actually authentic connection? And that would be a wonderful use of the digital age.
So this may be a question none of the three of you want to answer. It may risk professional credibility, but hearing you talk about the importance of attention in relationship, my experience in working with academic institutions is they are some of the most hostile and disintegrated environments on earth.
No.
And I'm really curious about what you believe the impact is of the nature of the science you conduct that is generated within institutions themselves that are so profoundly disintegrated. Anyone can go first.
Well, I'll say this, that, when I was in medical school at an academic university, the professors of medicine were focused on the physical side of reality. And these were clinicians, of course, but they were mostly researchers, and they were doing wonderful, wonderful, important research. But they focused on the physical side of reality. Now, it turns out in the brain, we have two very different perceptual systems. One is the system that sees the physical world, can be stimulated by visual things and auditory things. And there's a whole other set of circuitry that sees the mind. So when my professor of medicine would say, I just got your lab test back and the results suggest you're going to probably die in 3 months. I'm sorry, goodbye. And they would leave. I would say, don't you want to talk to them about how they feel? And the professors would actually say to me, why? Now, for someone who's only seeing the physical world, they have dispensed of the physical information. Your lab tests show you're dying. Your body will be gone. Goodbye. Good luck, And I couldn't really understand that. So later on, and we didn't know it then, but now we know there are two very different circuits. I call them mind-sight circuits, where you actually see the mind of yourself or others. It has to do with solitude and being present with yourself and attuning to the internal world or attuning to the world of someone else's interiority. So when you realize that, and then think about, I used to be in full-time academics. I'm not anymore. But when I was in full-time academics, I noticed that a lot of my colleagues were very physical circuit dominant. Let's put it that way. They didn't look at the interior of themselves or others, and they acted when you did like you were out of your mind. Now, actually, you were in your mind. And you were in their minds, which, of course, irritated them because they didn't think they existed. So that was a bit of a problem. So when you realize there are these two circuits, then you can say, all right, in the digital world we have, let's turn the focus of that digital world to the interior life that we have. Let's develop reflective ability. Let's develop these mind-sight maps. You have a mind-sight map of yourself that develops insight, a mind-sight map of others that's the basis of empathy. And we not only have those two mind-sight map-making things behind our foreheads, you also have a mind-sight map of we. And we need to move from just me to also we if this planet is going to survive. And we actually know steps to do that, but they begin with reflection. And there's nowhere better to start than the incredible innovative minds of the digital world to try to make that transition from me to also we.
Steve, what about for you?
Well, wanting to keep my job, I think I won't go too deeply into analysis of the shortfalls of academia. But I would say that I think that there, in addition to the institutions themselves, there's a sort of cultural canon in Western civilization that the way work gets done, especially sort of scientific work, is mostly around a solitary figure sort of pitting their intellect against the wily forces of nature or something like that. And the reality is that's actually not how humans have really accomplished anything in history. We always stand on the shoulders of the greats who went before us. Increasingly, the world is such a complicated place in the substance of academic research that no one person could possibly understand it at all. And so I think the mental image that structures, I greatly agree that it's a worldview that ends up creating these institutions, and the worldviews of the adherents, and they start selecting out the people who might be the most generative and brilliant thinkers just because they love to work with others as opposed to compete with others for grants or promotions or other kinds of scarce commodities, which really should be on some level sort of the birthright of intellectual work, not the prizes that you sort of snatch from the jaws of others to keep yourself alive. So I think this mental model we have about how science gets done, about how we understand the world, which is so based on our own personal experience, just sort of fails to capture the fundamentally social and in many respects sort of emotional nature of what it means to learn and grow and discover in a way that contributes to the whole of humanity.
Thank you. Can you all talk broadly for me about the relationship? I have a keen interest in the relationship between resilience and compassion and belonging. Yeah. Can you talk about that in terms of from a scientific perspective, the relationship between and among those concepts?
If it's okay, I just want to answer your last question
really
briefly and come clean. That actually UCSF has opened itself to self-examination for its cultural problems of lack of, support, innovation, creativity, and the number one problem faculty report is stress. And we have actually done a study of Hope Lab and presented it to UCSF. And I got to talk to Pat about how she has consciously created a culture for creativity, innovation, support, collaboration. And I honestly was shocked that such a culture existed. I had no perspective that I was actually completely unsupported by my environment. So it's a model that is on their website that was that we're trying to integrate, and that has been life-changing, actually.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. And was a totally stressful conversation as a result, right, Alyssa? Yeah. Thank you. That question was not intended to set up that answer, but I loved it, so thank you.
I had to come clean.
Thank you. So back to the relationship between resilience and compassion and belonging. Go ahead.
I'm going to be brief. I love this question. They are so deeply intertwined. We can think of a triangle. We can think of, well, clearly they're all connected. I think compassion has got to be the major driver. Compassion for self, compassion for others, which promotes the ability to have mindsight into others and have that belonging, and promotes resiliency. And as we talked about, feeling supported changes our brain state so that we're not as threatened, and that we're more have this wider narrative of our life, including our social network and others.
Thank you.
And from a stress perspective, being under chronic uncontrollable stress, which many of us have been at different times of our life, absolutely puts us on a steep path for growth in this triangle. It forces us this growth, and no question, contemplative practice can trigger and cultivate that growth.
Steve?
My answer is relatively simple. I think there's a relatively small number of modifiable ingredients for resilience, and chief among them is a sense of connection to others and belonging, and some of the fundamental sort of medium or glue for that connection is this sense of compassion, this ability to understand what other people are experiencing, how they're feeling about it, and really bring that into your own life in a way that allows you to both grow as a function of their experience and to be helpful to them, so that you as a collection of organisms basically can become greater than any one. That's the miracle of human biology, is that none of us alone could survive. The whole bet that human evolution made was that a bunch of small, relatively weak but pretty clever creatures could get together and really thrive in an environment dominated by much larger, nastier creatures and all kinds of uncontrollable forces of nature. So the fact that we even continue to exist is a testimony to the fundamental power of compassion. It may seem like a purely emotional event, but it is essentially the linchpin of all of human achievement, all of human evolution, all of what we would call today humanity as it exists.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Boy. Makes you feel
Pat,
inspired. Before I want to make sure we get some questions from the audience.
Oh,
Do
sure.
you mind? And then, does anybody have, if anybody has questions, I want to make sure we leave time for them. I get to talk to these, so yes. So you have to come up from the back. The microphone's up front. Oh, they're coming up, Dan. Go ahead.
Yeah. So in terms of this question about resilience and belonging,
Yes.
I think one thing that happens is the human experience is really vulnerable because of the way the brain is constructed to consider the self as isolated. And so when we talk about relationships being helpful, they're really supportive relationships, right? Because in attachment research, what we find is that you can have a relationship with a caregiver, but if it's actually not the way it ought to be going with secure attachment, which fortunately most people have, it actually leads to the opposite of resilience. It leads to a lot of vulnerabilities, to all sorts of problems. And so when you look at the kinds of relationships that are supportive, they're really integrated. It's where two people are honoring each other's differences and you're promoting compassionate connections. And ultimately, what emerges from that is the honoring of each other's vulnerabilities. This idea that you can be authentically present and there and accepted for who you are, and that's fundamentally what integration creates. So that kind of belonging allows you to say, okay, I have a me that's within this body, but it isn't an isolation. Yet so many people nowadays are living feeling like the self is separate and disconnected, and that you only are defined by your skin. And so the sad thing about that is it leads to this infinite consumerism, where people are going to consume, and this is in many ways what's consuming the planet. And so this idea of transforming awareness, I think, has to go deeply into where our identity is, where we realize we're not just a single self that can have infinite consumption, but we're actually a member of the whole planet Earth. And when we realize that membership, then things can really change.
This is also beautiful. I wanted to make one note related to something that Sherry said in her talk this morning, that image of the mother breastfeeding and then, looking at her phone. And how struck I was by what a disintegrated feeling I had in hearing that description. And it made me really appreciate this. We are increasingly living looking down. And even the notion of living looking up. We need to start living looking up and connecting to one another in that way. It just feels like a strong theme for me. First question.
Yes, hi. My question is two parts, so it's a little greedy. I am wondering, from what I understand in the recent research on physical proximity and the stress response is profoundly indicates that we have a natural decrease in stress response when we're physically present in ways that we don't, no matter how connected technologically we might be. And I'm wondering, with all the ways that we're finding to, kind of treat, to feel less lonely with technological connection, how can we think about this? Are we getting any stress reduction with that? Or are we just getting what's the difference in the loneliness that's quelled by technology versus proximity? And what's the implications for technology? That's part one.
You only get part one because there's a huge line behind you, but I love that you tried to get part two.
Yeah.
Anyone, if you could take it, please?
Well, I'll just say really briefly, I think that the world of mobile technology and the potential to really intervene into our day and help us be mindful has tremendous potential, but it can't be disconnected from people. So, for example, we're doing a training for parenting stress, for parents, particularly of children with autism, and actually that's with Will Kabat-Zinn and Teresa LaMendola. And what's beautiful about this is that the Brief in Contact workshop causes so much connection and transformation. And then this mobile device is not just a reminder to be in the present, but has their voice and triggers all the conditioning and memory of this connection. And so the two work well together.
Lovely. Next question.
Good morning, and thank you for an insanely rich panel.
Good morning.
And my question is, which practices have shown to be the most effective in activating telomerase and telomere protection?
I believe that's for you, Alyssa. Just a hunch I have.
Yeah. This is $1 million question. This is such a new area. There's a whole set of behavioral research on omegas and exercise, and then there's these really early studies that Steve mentioned on different contemplative practices. And I think regardless of how you get there, it's this increased meaning in life and connection with others, and this way of living that is not our habit, that we need some support and training in shifting to, away from the materialism, the consumerism, the looking down. And so I think we can be, our trajectory can be shifted, and this movement is, an amazing energy force that I know will permeate with all of the expertise in the room with social media and social connection. But this is the shift we need to make, and that is whether you're doing, yoga or mindfulness meditation, or having, changing the way you interact with people. All of these are fundamental. It comes down to presence, connection, and eudaimonia.
Thank you. Next question.
I'd love to hear from all three of our panelists, but the question is a large one and a amorphous one, but it's, when you think about the times that we live in, do you feel that as a species we are becoming more compassionate? I'm curious.
Dan.
I just came back from Thailand, where 1,000 people gathered together to really think about how to combine all our different scientific efforts in a kind of an initiative called One Health. And it was really a beautiful example of a yes answer to your question, at least the people that were there, where people were devoting their lives to really extending beyond just a self that's defined by the skin, but realizing you get meaning in life from connection, that there are efforts we're going to have to put in as a conscious human species to keep other species alive, to keep the planet alive, to keep our human family alive, and that this is really going to require feeling the vulnerability of the planet, feeling the vulnerability of other species, feeling the vulnerability of our own family, our extended family. And I think that's going to come from a widened consciousness that, in fact, you and I are actually a part of the same essence, that we are an identity. And when you experience that, the fullness of that is huge. And then when you look at things that Steve and Alyssa are talking about, where it's a win-win situation. You feel more meaning in life. You feel more connected. The planet can get better because of the compassion. And even your telomerase levels rise and your cells are happier. So why not, But it really requires getting rid of what Einstein called an optical delusion of our separateness. It requires that we truly work with families and schools and organizations to examine how the self is continually in modern culture defined as boundaried by the skin, that it's separate. And that's where I think compassion will become not something we have to teach, but something as natural as breathing.
Steve. Steve or Alyssa, anything to add on that?
I wouldn't dare.
Beautiful. Dan, well done.
Thank you.
One more, and we have time only for one more question, but then you can mob them like rock stars after the panel. So go ahead, please.
So this follows on the heels of that question, I think, very beautifully. But I'm interested to know if research shows the effects on the telomeres, or I don't know that word, but anyway, that function you were discussing. If research shows that there's a difference on those cell structures and how they heal between developing a sense of connection to one's loved ones and developing a sense of connection to, in the classic Buddhist sense, friends, enemies, and strangers. So the question is really, does research show that sitting inside a kind of expansive or divine love has an even more palliative effect on the body and, of course, on the social mind?
Oh,
well,
sure,
it's a fabulous question. I hope in a few years we'll know that answer.
Brilliant.
We can all guess and hedge our bets.
One final thing before we close. We will be doing, Hope Lab is actually hosting a breakout session following this session to delve more deeply into soliciting ideas on application of technology in service to supporting and unleashing resilience. So if you're interested in that, we'd love to have your thoughts and ideas, particularly for the technologists in the room. But it'll be over in one of the blue tents, so you can track us down over there. I cannot thank you all three enough. It's always a privilege for me, and I'm sure for them as well. So thank you.